So I would like to welcome everybody to these lectures on the political economy of populism, given by Sergei Guriev, currently at Sciences Po, scientific director of the master and PhD programs in economics, research fellow at the CEPR, also former chief economist at the EBRD, among many other things. So he's eminently qualified to talk on the topic, and there's a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Economic Literature on this. So Sergei, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Iikka, for this kind introduction and for organizing this lecture. It is a great honor and privilege to speak at BOFIT, and I'm very happy that so many people have registered. Indeed, this is a it's a presentation based on a survey that we wrote together with Elias Papagiannou from London Business School, which is coming out in the Journal of Economic Literature. Do you see my title slide now? It's fine? Okay.
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Good. So what we did with Elias, we worked on this subject for a while, and in 2019, we saw a great burst of attention and research on populism since 2016. And so we tried to see to what extent we can make sense of this literature and structure the debate how we understand it. We've read hundreds of papers and books, and the survey itself has a reference list of 300 items, out of which 250 were written or published after 2016 or 2016 and after. We also tried to link the current debate to the pre-2016 debate, because populism is not something that didn't exist before. And so this is a very, very long survey. I'm not very proud that you have to read 100 pages of text and 30 pages of references if you want to fully cover this ground. And in these 3 hours today and tomorrow, I'll try to provide some partial view of what we've learned when reading those papers. And I'll try to structure the main takeaways from this literature. But even in 3 hours, I will not be able to give justice neither to the literature nor even to our own survey. So this is the data. These are the data from Factiva that shows you how big the shock was in 2016 for the society. So if you look at Factiva news articles which contain populism or populist, you see that, well, there was growth in the 21st century. This growth was kind of stable and steady, but then there was a jump in 2016 when the number of articles pretty much doubled and continued to grow after 2016. Of course, what happened in 2016 was Brexit and election of Donald Trump. And that suddenly created a lot of attention in the society and among the scholars, of course, on what populism is and what it implies. And of course, populism was studied before. Populists have had victories before. I'll show you data on this. But it was 2016 that was a major watershed. So public actually didn't know what populism is and started to search in Google. And you see here I show the Google Trends data on searches for populism or populists around the world. And you see there was a jump for both by, again, factor of 1.5 or factor of 2 in 2016-17, where people try to figure out what populism and populist is. I should tell you that there is still no clear answer to this question. And I'll try to give you an answer, not the answer. But at least you see that there is a big, big shock for the society 2016-17. This is the search of on JSTOR. Academics also took notice that populism is an interesting topic. And here are the data which show that on JSTOR, number of articles, again, doubled or tripled in 2017 and 18. Again, it takes some time to write articles. So we shouldn't be surprised that it took at least a year for some people, and in our case, a couple of years, to write something up. So we shouldn't be surprised. But then, indeed, there is a burst, there is a great increase in the number of people working on this. It can only be compared to number of people working in 2020 on COVID. We actually, in our survey, have a section on COVID. If I have time, I'll talk about this, but most likely I won't. But there is now also literature which covers both COVID and populism. So there are papers on role of COVID for populism and role of populism for COVID. So what is the structure of our survey? So what we do, first and foremost, we look at the definition and the measurement. Second, we look at the drivers of the recent rise of populism. Third, and when we look at the drivers, we look at economic and non-economic factors. We look at long-term and short-term shocks. So we try to do justice to the literature, and the literature is huge. Then we look at a reasonably small literature of implications. So this is something that is much, much smaller because, again, the recent rise has been very recent. And so we still don't know the long-term consequences of Trump or Brexit for economic performance or social trends. But I'll show you some evidence. However, there is also historical evidence on populists in power for the last 100 years. I'll talk about that. And finally, the question is, if we think that populism is a problem, what should we do about this? And here I would give you the answer right away. We don't have rigorous answers to some of those questions. The last question we can only speculate about. But the first few questions, we actually have a lot of evidence, and some of this evidence is actually well identified. So let me first go to definition. So I have a Greek author. So in the paper, we immediately quote Socrates. Socrates said that definition of wisdom, beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. Without definitions, it's very hard to operationalize the measurement. And without the measurement, you have no chance to run quantitative studies. So let me give you the level of confusion that existed until very recently. So in 2016, Jan Werner Müller wrote a short book about populism. So he wrote it before Trump and Brexit. And there he is actually making a very important point that a lot of experts just use the negative connotation of populism and label everybody that we, the cosmopolitan liberal democratic elites, don't like a populist. And so, of course, that is not nice. We need something more operational. And of course, we need something which can be rigorously categorized. So the Justice Potter Stewart's definition is not useful. So Barry Eichengreen wrote a book about populism, which was published 3 years ago. And there he opens with this quote from Supreme Court Justice Stewart's definition of pornography. So Stewart wrote that I don't need to define pornography because I know it when I see it. So a lot of people would say, I instinctively know what populism is, so I know when I see it. And of course, we know that generally populists are people who refer to suffering of the people. And also usually in economics, we think about populists as demagogues who make unsustainable, unrealistic, oversimplified solutions. And this is what is probably based on our experience with populism in Latin America. For an average economist, what we know about populism until, say, 5 or 10 years ago would be this magisterial volume by Dornbusch and Edwards, published in 1991, called Macroeconomics of Populism in Latin America, and it covers 20th century Latin American left-wing populism, which is an approach in economics where you neglect macroeconomic constraints and promise income growth and redistribution. And those promises are actually unrealistic because once you neglect macroeconomic constraints, they hit back at you. And what happens is hyperinflation or debt crisis or both. So this is the definition we would use until, say, 10 years ago. And even if you look at one theoretical paper about populism, a pre-2016 paper, which came out in the top journal by Asimoglu, Guriev, and Sonian, it looks exactly at this brand of populism, because this was the brand economists were thinking about when they were asked about populism. Now, some of that exists today, but the most exciting research agenda today is the Trump and Brexit populism, which is not left-wing. And so I'll talk about that. And so this is where we should use other definitions. And this is where political scientists have produced a better definition, and that dates back to Cas Mude's work in 2004, and his work co-authored with Cristobal Rivera Kaltwasser, published more recently, which is that populism is not an ideology, or it's a thin-centered ideology. It doesn't really have much substance. It's a worldview. It's a view of the world where you divide the society into homogeneous is very, very important, homogeneous and antagonistic groups, pure people and corrupt elite. And so this view of the world, by definition, suggests that the society should be run by people, not by the elite, because the people have moral grounds, moral source of political power. So why did I mention homogeneity? Because populists are not just anti-elite political activists or politicians or parties, because they also emphasize this homogeneity within the people. And homogeneity immediately means that you don't need things like checks and balances. Checks and balances are usually things which are produced, invented by the elites, and we don't like the elites. And we don't need checks and balances because all people are the same. So you don't need representative democracy, you don't need central banks, sorry, Iikka, you don't need antitrust regulators, you don't need independent courts. And this is what populists usually hate and try to suppress, okay? So what exactly populists want to do, they don't say. If the masses want the redistribution, the society should pursue redistribution. If masses want nativist politics, they should do nativist politics. If masses want pro-trade or anti-trade sentiment, let's do that. So in that sense, populism is not, in this definition, is not pursuing any left-wing or right-wing ideology. It may go whichever way, depending on what actually people want. So this is the definition which has been prevalent in political science. So the other political scientists add additional properties. So I mentioned Jan Werner Müller. Is very clear that for him, populists are based on three pillars: anti-elite, because elites are corrupt and immoral; anti-pluralists, so since people are homogeneous, you don't need checks and balances; and identity politics. The populists define who the right people are. And this definition is similar to Mude Rivera Kaltwasser, but this definition actually is less broad, because in addition to these two properties, it adds another property and therefore narrows down the definition of populist. Not all populists in Mude Rivera Kaltwasser definition are identitarian. So this is where Müller's definition is more narrow than Mude Rivera Kaltwasser. Now, what about other political scientists? There is a very important book and very famous book by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, published in 2018, who again say that populism is a discourse style, and they say exactly the same thing: anti-elite, morality, and again, silent on what exactly needs to be done. And finally, they focus on authoritarian populists. They don't really say that there are no non-authoritarian populists, but their book is about authoritarian populists, and they focus their analysis on that. So their definition is slightly more narrow than Mude Rivera Kaltwasser, because, for example, they would not classify Syriza as their subject of study, because Greek left-wing Syriza populists are actually democratic populists who didn't want to destroy checks and destroy democratic institutions, and were voted out from power and stepped down peacefully. Okay. Now, Barry Eichengreen also emphasizes anti-elite, but also authoritarian and nativist tendencies. So you have one minimal definition by Ravira Kaltwasser, and you also have additional definitions by other authors who make the definition more narrow. Together with Elias, we actually focus on these two properties introduced by Mude and Ravira Kaltwasser, and we call it the minimal definition: anti-elite and homogeneity. And these two features provide us with a longer list of populist leaders. And in fact, when you look at quantitative studies of populists, usually these lists are somewhat different, but usually they're close to each other, and they all refer to these two features. So let me stop here to see if there are questions, because I've been talking for 15 minutes. So Iikka, if you see questions on the chat,
yes, there are actually questions. First from Daniil Galubev. Is it possible to say that populism answers the demands of the audience and forms them at the same time, some sort of iterative process? Okay.
Yeah, I'll talk about narratives and communication technology. And jumping ahead, I think in one of the first slides I mentioned communication technology, but jumping ahead, I would say that looks like social media are extremely important for understanding today's rise of populism. And in that sense, this polarization due to echo chambers and filter bubbles played a very important role. And populists do follow their audience's views, but they also, of course, try to affect them as well. And we don't have good evidence on whether the rise of populism is due to misleading the audience, but there are some pieces of evidence that would be in line with this view. And I'll talk about that probably tomorrow rather than today.
Okay, thanks. Then Orkun Saka has a question on the sort of whole concept of or definition of populism. That over time, is it possible to have a historically consistent measure of populism?
Yes. So what people do, they use today's definition and go back to 1900. And so I'll show you one paper by Funke, Šuliarik, and Trebesh, which actually gives you the full list of populists in power. They don't look at all populists. They only look at populists who made it to the government office. And they count 50 populists like this, and they give you the complete list of people in power who we would today classify as populists. And I actually have a slide with this list. So I'll show it to you. And I highly recommend this paper, because this paper also shows you what populists do when they're in power. And this is one of the most important papers. And we refer to this paper and we discuss this paper in our survey.
Okay, then perhaps one more, and then we can move on. That's from Ananai Agarwal. Is populism always based on class warfare, or can the elite be an identity too?
So I will talk exactly about this, because what's happened in the recent few years, especially in the last 10 years, you see a shift in the dimensionality of politics from left-right, class-based political cleavage to either multidimensional politics or to politics based on identity dimension. And indeed, elites usually come from the same identity as you are, but elites may be blamed by populists for supporting non-real people, like immigrants, minorities, and so on. And this is where suddenly populists do put identity dimension in the center of political cleavage. And I'll talk about that. There are studies which actually look exactly into this. And yes, identity matters. And this is one of the biggest shifts in the last 10 years, that a lot of politics moved from left versus right to us versus them, globalist versus parochial. but also conservative, cultural conservative versus cultural liberal. So I'll talk about that. And yes, I think it's a good question. Good.
Okay, great. Then perhaps we'll move on, and then there are further questions, but we can then take them up later. Thanks.
Good. So this is the slide which directly answers one of the questions in the chat by Maxim Vorobyov. Why so often we have strong leaders? Why do we often see authoritarian populists? And the answer is, well, in the definitions that I mentioned, there is nothing immediately implying that populists must be anti-democratic, right? However, there is a tendency to see strong leaders. Why? Because you actually don't need many collegial decision-making institutions. Why? Because if everybody is the same, and homogeneity is part of the game, right? Homogeneity is implying that all the people are the same. So populists say, if all the people are the same, then you just need one strong leader, like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not a working class person from Middle West. He's a New York-based, now Florida-based billionaire. And yet he says, since all people are the same, I represent you. And this is very, very interesting. Another issue is new communication technology. So you don't need the fourth estate, you don't need checks and balances, because you can reach out to 90 million people through Twitter. And so we'll talk about that. But in general, it is interesting how populism is supposed to be representing the people. But in the end of the day, you end up very often having one strong leader being in power, dismantling institutions of representative democracy and checks and balances. And so this is quite striking, but this should not be taken as a surprise given that definition. Once again, from now on, I will be using this definition, which is based on two features. Definition which is coming from two items introduced by Mude and Ravira Kaltwasser as a minimal broadest definition. So I will allow for democratic populists, but as I said, anti-pluralism almost immediately suggests that there is a scope for strong leaders. Now, does that mean that we should completely neglect the Economist definition? Now, this is interesting that it looks like Economist's 1991 definition of non-sustainable macroeconomic promises, irresponsible policies, demagoguery, is orthogonal to political scientists' definition. But it's not exactly true. Why? Because once you start fighting elites and checks and balances, you may destroy economic checks and balances as well. So you may say antitrust regulators are bad because they don't allow free entrepreneurship, which is bad. Courts stop me from carrying out the will of the people. Central bank doesn't allow me to print as much money as I need. And this is, by now, actually, it's quite uncommon to have populists doing what they did in the 20th century and create macroeconomic disasters. We still have Donald Trump criticizing Federal Reserve. We still have Erdogan successfully fighting his central bank. And we have Venezuela, of course. But more often than not, populists have learned 20th century's macroeconomic lessons. Yet they don't like whoever wants to stop them, which of course results in lack of checks and balances. And checks and balances, of course, are good for not just political liberalism and liberal democracy in general, but also for economic growth, because investors like checks and balances. Investors like rule of law. Investors like predicted rules of the game. And so in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that many populists, while they don't promise to destroy macroeconomics, but they can actually undermine investment climate, and that may result in lower economic growth. And I'll talk about that. Okay, so what about measurement? So once we have this definition, what is the definition? The definition that we will use is exactly these two items, anti-elite and anti-pluralism. So we can go around the world and try to measure which politicians are populist and which are not. Now, the problem, of course, is that in some cases, some politicians are a little bit populist or a lot populist, And some measurements are continuous, and some measurements are actually binary. Then the next question is, when you ask me, how big was the rise of populism, say, in 2016 or in 2010? How can I answer that? Should I count the votes they get in the elections? Or should I count the share of seats in the parliament or number of populists in government? These are very different questions, because depending on the electoral system, share of votes and share of seats connection may be very nonlinear. So for example, in many countries, you can have 10 populist parties, each gets 1% of the vote, and none of them makes it into the parliament. Okay, share of seats is 0. Well, share of votes is like 10%. So this is a difficult measurement issue. Then there is an issue of handling differences between presidential and parliamentary regimes. How to weight different countries, by size or just each country is one observation. Also, the longer back you go in time, the harder it is to collect data, of course. And again, today, a lot of countries are democracies which were not democracies 100 years ago, and some countries even didn't exist. So all these issues are very, very difficult. And so measurement is very problematic. So don't be surprised that different papers give you different results. So let me just give you a few examples of how to measure populism. So there is a book by Stein van Kessel, which came out before 2016. It's actually 2015, and his data end in 2013. So he goes through Europe plus 3 countries, which are European countries, but not part of EU 28. He uses Kosmodes definition, and he identifies 51 populist parties in those countries, right? And so then he just tells you so many parties are populist, and he goes country by country, and he shows in which countries populist parties have done a better job, with which they didn't, but at least you have a exhaustive list of populists in Europe. And this is a 0-1 classification. Each party is either populist or not. Now, Chapel Hill expert survey is different. So this is a survey which is based in the University of North Carolina, where the Center for European Studies surveys hundreds of political scientists around the world who work on Europe. So they call people working on Norway and ask them, what are the party positions on this, and that? What do you think? And so they have this data set which tells you party positions on various issues. And the first time they started to measure the anti-establishment rhetoric was 2014. Then they did 2017 subset of countries. For 2017 survey, they only covered subset of countries, and 2019 they covered all the countries again. So they can measure the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric. Salience of reducing political corruption can also be viewed as populist. But this is where I would remind you that anti-elite and anti-political corruption for me is not enough, because you may have a country where you have a corrupt government and opposition politicians who criticize political corruption, who actually favor introduction rule of law, maintaining checks and balances, and so on. So I won't call those opposition politicians populists. But yet, of course, in Europe, the governments are not that corrupt. But in any way, in any event, this is just I don't fully approve of this measure, but this is what they do. And then there is also a Guardian project, which brings together several leading political scientists who work on Europe. And they have this website called Populist, where they also cover 31 countries, and they identify 82 parties. And so you can click on this website and you can actually see their list of populists. So, and Guardian project is a bit more broad because it goes outside Europe as well, but on this website it covers Europe. So there are different views, different measures. I'll show you other measures as well. But before going further, let me show you what Chapel Hill Expert Survey, for example, does. So that's a typical chart from Chess research papers. So here you see on the horizontal axis, you have anti-elite silence. So parties on the right are parties who talk a lot about how elites are bad and corrupt. And on the vertical axis, I show you the anti-EU and pro-EU, and you see a strong negative strong negative correlation. Each dot here is a party. So, for example, this is Podemos. This is Linke, the left-wing party in Germany. Then this is, I think, Polish civil platform. Interestingly, AfD is here. It's not really it's not really as similar to Podemos as some other parties. So you see centrist parties like CSU. You see pro-market parties like FDP on the other side of the spectrum. But you have the whole spectrum of parties. And what I'm saying here, you can actually see the measures of populist and non-populist throughout the whole European continent. You see differences of those parties, and you have a continuous measure, right? Another continuous measure is something which was built by two Italian political scientists, Italo Calantoni and Piero Stanik, who measure, for example, all political parties in Europe in economic ideology. And this is left versus right, and globalization versus nationalism. And here they cover 14 European countries only. But the good news is for those parties, they actually fully classify the whole party spectrum. And here you see populist left parties, radical right parties, and you see how ideology changes. And I'll show you the dynamics over time of this classification as well. Now, I again was talking for 15 minutes, but actually let me go through a couple more slides, so it will be more material to answer. Okay, Arkun Saka says that he now sees what I wanted to show. Okay, that's good. So what happened over time? So I'll show you a few graphs over time. So this is a graph from Dani Rodrik, who looked at 60 countries around the world, which at some point since 1960s had at least one populist party, a party that you can classify as populist. And here you see a very important rise in populist parties in the 21st century. Now Rodrik's data finish by 2015, but you actually see a great increase in vote share in his data set, right? So this is his disaggregated data set where he splits Europe and Latin America, and he shows that he can actually attribute the growth of populism to the increase of right-wing parties, and in Europe, rather than populist parties in Latin America or left-wing parties in Europe. Now, left-wing parties in Latin America are still popular, but you don't see a major trend. Right-wing parties are almost non-existent in Latin America, even though I should say that the data set finishes in 2015, and in 2018, Jair Bolsonaro won the election in Brazil. But in Europe, in his data set, you have a substantial growth, okay? So this is the next slide. I can see in the chat that there is a 20-second delay. So the next slide is from Calantoni and Stanik data set, which I showed to you. They classify parties according to two dimensions, looking at pro-trade and anti-trade, right and left. And you see that in those 14 countries in Europe, there is a rise of economic nationalists and actually substantial increase of isolational left. And all of that is happening at the cost of pro-trade right. And I'll talk more about that, what's happening in Europe with the incumbent elite parties. But in general, what they show that in those 14 countries in Europe, they have both the rise of radical left, but also the rise of radical right. Now, the magnitudes here are not huge, but substantial, right? So the radical right between 85, when they start their data, go up by 5 percentage points or even more until 2015. Now, the book by Engelhardt and Norris shows you data from Paralgov dataset, which again shows you a doubling of share of populist vote share by decades. They show that it went up from 6% to 12% by 2017. So I'm not really a particular fan of this particular picture, but let me actually skip that. So this is the picture on European subnational region. This is coming from our paper with Elias and with Jan Elgan and Evgenia Passari in Brookings Papers of Economic Activity. This is what we do, where we split Europe not into countries, but into subnational regions. So this chart is based on 26 European countries and more than 240 subnational regions and the level of NUTS 2, right? And so this is a histogram of distribution before and after global financial crisis of 2008, 9, and 10. And so if you look at this data, you see that the whole distribution moved right. So you see that in some regions, you actually see that populist parties get 100% of the vote. This is something that we wouldn't observe before the global financial crisis. And overall, you see that there are very few regions now, about less than 20%, less than 15% of the whole set of regions where populists have 0% of the vote. So the rise of populism is not just because a couple of regions have become much more populist. No, the whole distribution have moved drastically to the right, okay? And finally, before I break for questions, I'll show you this chart from our survey. So this is the chart where I took several classifications at the same time, did population weighted analysis, and traced them in the 21st century. So this is the chart I built pretty much myself with a research assistant, where I took populist party classification from a Swedish think tank, Timbro. So this is a populism index website. They actually say that they look at only authoritarian populists. So their numbers are slightly below other numbers because they exclude democratic populists. So the other quadrants are the populist.org website. So this is from a paper based on populist data. So I took their classification and also did population weighted. And the two other things, Elgan et al. Is the paper I just mentioned, and Guriev et al. Is the paper with Nikita Melnikov and Ekaterina Zhuravska, which is coming out in QG. All of these four graphs show you Europe, or more exactly, either EU28 minus a couple of countries or EU28 plus 3 or 4 or 5 countries. So the composition is similar, and it's all population weighted anyway. And you see that the trends are extremely similar. Whatever classification you take, you end up with a similar outcome, which is there was growth in the first decade of this century, and this growth was steady but minor. And then it was great acceleration in the second decade, especially after 2016. And today we are talking about populist parties getting between 25 and 30% of the vote, which is roughly twice as much as they would get 20 years ago. So whatever classification you look at in Europe, you have a great growth of those parties. And most of this growth is due to right-wing populists. So this is the populist project data set, where you actually see that most of the growth was due to far-right populist parties and not far-left populists, even though far-left populists have also increased their presence. So let me actually stop here and see if there are questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Sergei. I'll pose at least 2 questions that are pertinent to the what we just heard. There's a question, actually 2 questions from Eleonora Brandi-Marti. How would you characterize the relationship between political polarization and populism? And then further, can there be populism without a personification of politics? These are important questions.
Right, these are excellent questions. And yes, we see 2 trends going on in the last 20 years. Actually, polarization in the US started even before. And a lot of people would actually link polarization and populism. Polarization in recent years has at least partially been explained by the rise of social media. And I'll talk about that, but let me briefly actually say that now. There is an excellent paper on social welfare effects on social media. It's called Welfare Effects of Social Media by Alcott and Getsko and another co-authors who I forgot, I'm sorry about this, which came out in AER last year, where they do a randomized control trial in the US. They switch off the Facebook for a month for a treatment group, and they see what happens to those people. So these people, after a month, are happier. Apparently using Facebook makes you less happy. Then they're less aware about politics, but they are also less polarized. And so they have a causal effect of social media use on polarization. And I'll show you also a causal effect of social media on populists. So these things may go hand by together, together jointly. Whether they cause each other is hard to say, but there is a lot of evidence that is consistent with the hypothesis that polarization helps populists. Now, populists, of course, are saying that they represent the masses and majority, but this is not always true. So, for example, Polish populists won the election without simple majority. Hungarian populists today are not supported by a majority, and Donald Trump has never been supported by a majority. So this is also a function of electoral system. So if you mobilize your polarized base, that already can bring you a long way to win the election. So another question is personification. There are populists who are party populists. And whatever we think about Greek populists like Syriza, they're really a party rather than one person. And it's not just Tsipras and nobody else who matters. No, it's really a party. They really have a party set of views. And in that sense, it's not always the case. But as I mentioned before, in this idea that you don't need checks and balances may create a demand for a strong leader. And so that's why we have a lot of populists who are personalized political movements. And as I mentioned before, you have social media that help that as well. Now, I would say that the first populists in history were American People's Party, and they did have a personification of that movement, a presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president in 1996. But interestingly, he was also a candidate from a mainstream party. And also the movement was much bigger than just one person. And so if you think about the first populists in history, they were not personalized and they were extremely heterogeneous, actually. So in that sense, I won't say that definition of populism implies exactly that it should be personalized, but I would say that it's often personalized because of this homogeneity issue. Okay. So yeah, another question?
Yeah, so this is actually relates directly to the measurement of populism and the populist parties. From Mikhail Galashin, is it mostly, I guess, a rise of the vote share of populist parties? Is it mostly due to parties becoming more populist or voters switching parties? Can we split the two?
So I'll talk about that. This is heterogeneous. Mostly it's through the emergence of new parties. But some centrist parties move. And so we saw how Republican Party moved, and we saw how Conservative Party moved. And we see how some system parties become more populist. Systemic parties become more populist. But it's actually hard because the very key of populist discourse is anti-elite. And so it's actually very hard for populists to be part of the elite party and yet remain populist. So in most cases, it's emergence of new players. And there is a book by Catherine de Vries, I'm not sure I pronounce her Dutch name correctly, which just came out on new parties, on political disruptors in Europe, who shows how these parties emerge and how they operate. Now, in the survey, we also refer to a couple of papers, which I'm not going to talk about the lecture, so read the survey, which show the causal effect of emergence of populists and the rise of populists on mainstream parties. So they show that when extreme right parties cross the threshold and get into the parliament, the center-right parties actually move towards the right. And this is a causal effect because they use the discontinuity at the threshold, right? So you can say that. So voters switch parties towards new populist parties. That's the mechanism. And I'll show you exactly that, for example, green parties don't benefit. So green parties rise through another mechanism. Let me also advertise that I will talk, although not today, about corruption in countries dominated by populist parties. Okay, so that is something that I will talk. That was a question by one of the people in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Another
exactly.
question? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question from Yugal Burtel. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So basically, to paraphrase, is populism a reaction to liberal democratic parties? And some argue that populism is a reaction of the majority, in quotes, against the perceived over-appeasement of minorities, again in quotes, by liberal democrats, or I guess also in the liberal democracies. Yeah.
So this is something I cannot really prove. I can only speculate, and I'll show you that. Some people would say, if you talk about non-economic factors, and I'll show lots of economic factors that can explain the rise of populism. I'll show you the technological factors, but this is a kind of bigger picture where you cannot easily identify the causal effects because we are talking about a global trend, right? The end of the Cold War, the rise of liberal democracy, and so on. It's very hard to identify the causal effects. But I can speculate, and I generally agree with Yugal. And I would say that, yes, since the West lost an enemy, suddenly it started to splinter inside, within. So you don't have an external enemy. So the elites became complacent. And also within the Western society, populist players started to fight the elites rather than an external enemy. I should also say that another secular trend in politics is something related to my other research agenda, which is informational autocrats. Together with Daniel Trisman and myself, we show how since the end of the Cold War, we observe the emergence and growth in quantitative terms of a new model of dictatorship, where new autocrats pretend to be democrats. No longer you have brutal mass repression. New autocrats are different. And we also say that this is, at least in part, related to globalization, the march of liberal democracy, of new technology, of liberal multinational regime, which no longer is easy to fight. It's easier to pretend to be part of, and yet continue to do censorship and propaganda within, and remain an autocrat. But in any event, I think we underestimate to what extent there was a systemic change of this end of history of 1990s that Yugal is referring to, that suddenly the West lost an existential threat and lost a common project. By now, we see the rise of a new common existential fight, which is the fight against the global climate change. And that may replace the fight against Nazism and communism, but indeed, many things have changed once the existential threat has disappeared. Okay. So let me continue.
Well, perhaps one more, and then because there are several questions
go ahead.
about this. So there's one from Brian Charles. Why do we call it populism instead of right-wing extremism? Why not call it what it is and maintain analytical clarity? What does the addition of populism add to analysis? That's a provocative question.
So this is a great question. And as you can imagine, I talk a lot to non-academics, and non-academics often tell me, well, you're wrong. You shouldn't call this populism, or you shouldn't call that populism. But in this literature in economics and computer and economics and political science, and actually in sociology, there is this definition which stuck. And we use this definition because it's easier to talk to each other. Sometimes it's hard to talk to people outside of our academic bubble. That's for sure. But in this particular case, when you're asking me why don't we call it extreme right or far right or radical right? Well, because there are left-wing populists. So I would call Chavez left-wing populist. I would call Syriza left-wing populist, and they're not extreme right. They're not identitarian necessarily. So this is slightly different. And so in that sense, there is something common to all these anti-elite movements. And we need to understand them together. But of course, as you rightly say, there is a difference between left-wing populists and right-wing populists. And I will talk about France, for example, because on France we have excellent data, very detailed data, and we can actually see what the difference between left-wing populists and right-wing populists and people who vote for them. And France is also an excellent case because, for example, in 2017 presidential election, both left-wing populist candidate and right-wing populist candidate got 20% of the vote. So France is a place where you have lots of support of populists. So anyway, so let me go on. And I like the fact that you're asking a lot of questions, and the whole point of this lecture is actually to be interactive. And I'm very happy to skip some of the material tomorrow. There is nothing wrong with that because eventually we'll put slides online and the paper is online. So it's not my goal to skip through the slides very quickly. So I'm happy to answer questions. But still, let me talk for another 15 minutes right now. So this is the chart from the paper I already referred to several times. This is the long-term history of populism, compiled by Funke, Shularek, and Trebesh, which just got released as a working paper just less than half a year ago. So in this paper, they look at 60 large countries, which account for 95% of global GDP, so the largest countries in the world. And they start their count from 1900, and they only look at populists in power. And they find 50 populist governments. And here you see different colors for right-wing and left-wing populists. And you see that today we have unprecedented rise of populists in power. So, and this rise in the last 20 years was mostly due to the rise of radical right rather than radical left. So left-wing populists have also been on the rise in the last years. But if you actually look at the change from year 2000 to 2018, that's where the data end, the rise of right-wing populists was actually larger. And you see that what we observe today is unprecedented in history. So this is where we are. Now, as I mentioned, the first populists probably started in the US before 1900, but they didn't get to government anyway. So William Jennings Bryan lost the election in 1896. So this is a good start. And just to show you the list from that paper, so this is showing you all the countries where populists at least once came to power. And you see the spells of left-wing and right-wing populists. And some of these people you would not call populists, but I actually agree with the authors. For example, Boyko Borisov runs a government with a party which is called GERB, which is Citizen Pro-European Movement. But many things he does and says are very similar to what Orban does. So you can see that some parties that are on paper pro-European are actually quite populist. And there is a very important typo that Taksin Shinawatра's last name is Taksin, but for some reason the authors, even though I told them so, the authors for the moment have not changed this picture, but I hope they will change this picture. Anyway, so this is the list, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of people would disagree with this list. But overall, I would like to emphasize it again and again. Whatever classifications you look at, you get the same picture. And you get this takeaway that there is a rise of 10-15 percentage points in the last 20 years, out of which about 10 percentage points in the last 10 years, at least in Europe. And different measurements give you this picture, which is similar. The rise was steady in the first 10 years of this decade, and then it accelerated in the second year. So this is something that we need to think about. So let me now talk about the drivers. So in this particular survey, we go through a long list, and the long list includes economic factors and non-economic factors. Non-economic factors include culture, which is the backlash against silent revolution. So silent revolution is the march of progressive values. So cohort after cohort becomes more and more tolerant, more and more in favor of gender equality and protection of minority rights. And 50 years ago, Ronald Inglehart called it silent revolution. And now he wrote a book how white middle-aged men like myself, well, people who look like myself, not men like myself, are unhappy about this, and there is a cultural backlash against that. And so the book Cultural Backlash is exactly about this. Now, another issue is immigration. I'll show you the data on immigration, how immigration has become much more salient in many countries, which of course also is linked to the issues of identity. Now, the question about cultural explanations is why now? Cultural issues cultural divides are extremely persistent. And so the question is why now? What has changed now? And I'll show you some ideas about this, which issues have actually been more pertinent in recent years. And another explanation would, of course, be that there is a tipping point explanation. And Malcolm Gladwell's book is extremely influential, that you have a critical mass of a long-term accumulation of issues and problems. And another issue is trigger, which could be the rise of social media or shock of global financial crisis or influx of refugees in 2015. And finally, there is an issue of communications technology, which has been extremely fast in the last 10 years. So, and then there are economic factors, and some of these factors are slow moving, and some of these factors are very fast and kind of one-off shocks. So slow moving factors are globalization and technological change, and one-off factors are global crisis and the austerity, which followed after the global economic crisis. Now, I should say that as an economist, I can tell you that economic factors are things which we can easily measure, or at least we have easier time to measure economic factors than cultural factors for a number of reasons that will become clear later. But also it's good if this is driven by economics, because we know how to fix economic problems. It's much harder to fix cultural problems. And that's why economists look for economic explanations, because not just because this is where the light is, but also because they think that there is an optimism regarding solutions. Okay. So all these economic factors are very familiar to everybody who is interested in those issues and in general in political economy. So globalization, of course, promotes growth overall, but creates both winners and losers. And losers are extremely unhappy, and many national governments fail to compensate losers. So in Europe, things are not as bad as in the US, where the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act is very, very small relative to the problems which were caused by globalization in the last 20 years. But even in Europe, you have an issue, and I'll talk about that. Technological progress, same thing. Robots increase overall productivity, but create winners and losers. And of course, both things create inequality, because gains from globalization and technological progress accrue to the richer people. And this is especially true in case of technological progress. And finally, the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, it's a great opportunity for populists because it originates elsewhere. So you cannot actually blame it on yourself. You can blame it on cosmopolitan elites. You can blame it on regulators. And again, you can blame the governments that fail to withstand the impacts on the losers. And of course, the crisis created huge economic pain. So, So what is important about this is job polarization. So once again, if you think about how these factors affect labor markets, what is important to understand is they hit the middle. So if you think about globalization, for example, competition with imports helps people who export their services, like us. We talk online, we produce globally competitive research. Bankers' services are also in demand globally. Lawyers, McKinsey consultants, software engineers benefit from globalization and automation. Now, people at the bottom may also benefit because their jobs are protected from outsourcing and automation because their salaries are very low. So it's hard and economically not reasonable to automate or offshore their jobs. But people in the middle, routine middle skill jobs, these are actually vulnerable to offshoring, outsourcing, and automation. Usually we are talking about blue collar workers without tertiary education or routine white collar jobs. And we have evidence on the US and on Europe alongside all of those dimensions. So let me show you the pioneering work of Autor and Doran from 2013. That is probably the most striking graph that tells you the story of job polarization in the US. So what they do, they take occupations, they rank them by occupational mean wage. So on the right, you have high paid occupations. On the bottom, you have low paid occupations. And they ask a question, what is the change in employment in 25 years between 80 and 2005? And you see that most of the job growth has been in the top range and in the bottom range, while jobs between 15% and 55% actually have been destroyed. So job market polarization is where jobs in the middle are destroyed, jobs at the top are created, especially at the very top, and jobs at the bottom are created. And so if you are in the middle, you have to decide what to do. Either you learn computer science and move to the top, which is of course hard, especially if you are 50 years old, it's hard to learn new skills. Or you go back to low skill jobs, but there the salary will be lower. And also you'll exert downward pressure on wages because you increase competition, you increase supply in that segment. So it's not good either. Or you can actually quit labor force, start playing video games, and many of these people unfortunately die from opioid epidemics. And this is the death of despair story, if you like, right? So the same thing is in wages. So if you look at the growth of wages rather than jobs in the US, from the very same paper, you see that wages are growing faster at the very top of the distribution. In the middle, the growth of wages in 25 years was 10 percentage points, which means less than 1% a year, half a percentage point a year, which is not great. So this is where the job polarization, labor market polarization tells you the story of growing inequality due to those trends. I'm not yet showing you the causal effects. I'll show it later, but it's just a summary statistic which shows you the trends. The same is true in Europe, where the paper by Goes, Manning, and Solomon, American Economic Review 2014, shows you country by country the change in the structure of employment. And so you see that you have occupations which are lowest paying occupations, highest paying occupations, and middle paying occupations. And you see country by country, you move from basically 50% of employment in the middle to 40% of employment. Everywhere we have a change by something like 10 percentage points decrease in middle skill employment. And this is pretty much the same. There you have some outliers, but you pretty much have the same picture, a major change where jobs are destroyed in the middle and move either to the top or to the bottom. And of course, over long periods of times, more and more people get tertiary education. So younger people are more likely to end up in the higher paid occupations. But still, a lot of middle-aged, especially white men, lose their jobs in the middle and need to figure out what to do. Now, this is the list of Gauss, Manning, Solomon's papers, occupations, sorry, high, middle, and so on. So if you ask me what your kids should learn, at least based on those couple of decades, you want to teach your kids to become corporate managers, engineers, life science or health, and maybe small business entrepreneurs. In any event, the important issue here is offshoreability, routine task index, and of course, if your job is automatable, it's more likely to be displaced. If it's offshoreable, it's more likely to be displaced. And so you see positive numbers in the middle to be more likely than at the top. Okay. Now, when we talk about the causal effect, what these papers do, they say we had this huge shock of rise of China's imports, and that's been done for both US and Europe. So here the exogenous variation is due to the accession of China into WTO in 2001. In the next several years saw very fast growth of Chinese imports into the United States. And they, of course, hit different localities differently. Because if your locality specializes in the industry which is competing with Chinese imports, you're in trouble. And if your locality benefits from Chinese imports, because Chinese imports are cheap inputs for your production, you're doing well. And so what they do, they use the Bartik instrument, if you like. They look at other developed countries, and they look at how other developed countries increase their imports from China, and they use it as an instrument for industrial structure of vulnerability to Chinese imports. And then they look at the composition of local economy, and that is the index of the shock of Chinese imports. And so they identify the causal effect in the US, and they show a huge effect in manufacturing employment, unemployment, wages, and also disability and income assistance transfer benefits. They also, in a different paper, they show that even marriage outcomes are in trouble. So men who live in those places have harder time marrying. So, and that of course results in political implications. So they show that if in 2006, if increase in China's imports were half as large, then in 2016 elections, the outcome would be different. So this is what we observe here. Let me say before breaking for questions, let me say that the same was observed in Europe by Colantoni and Stanning. They've done exactly the same study, except for 400 commuting zones. They look at subnational regions, NUTS 2. They actually have a separate paper on Brexit, and they also show the impact was large and actually resulted in a major impact on the voting for radical right parties. They look at the similar instrument as well. So it's interesting when you look at those papers, in order to identify the causal effect in the United States, you look at the rise of Chinese import by industry in other developed countries. When you do it for Europe, you do the same. So pretty much America is instrument for Europe, Europe is instrument for America. Luckily, there is also Japan, New Zealand, Australia, which are not part of those stories. But still, it's a methodologically interesting point that I would like to share with you. So this is the chart from Colantoni and Stanning for Brexit. You can see how the size of the import shock from China is actually correlated with the lived vote share. Okay, so a couple more slides, and then I'll stop for today. So the same studies have been done by automation. So on automation, people usually use data on industrial robots. What is the data set of industrial robots? So there is this international organization, pretty much a trade union of robot producers, of industrial robots producers, in International Federation of Robotics, which has data on how many industrial robots were sold to each country in each industry in each year. And so you can get this data for several $1,000s. And more likely than not, every research you see today on robotization is based on this data set, where you can actually see which industries are more vulnerable to automation. And again, you use exposure to robots by using the rise of robots in same industry in a different country. And this is what Freiberger and Chen do for the US. They look at the rise of robots in the same industries in different countries, and they show that outcome of 2016 presidential election was causally affected by the robotization of American industry. And they identify 3 or 10 percentage points effects, which are of course huge. So, and this is the chart from this paper where you show the percentage points change vote share Trump versus Romney, and you see how it's correlated with the changes in the exposure to robots. It's as far as I remember, equal beam aggregation. The same has been done in Europe by Calanton and Stanik and their co-author Anelli. They look at 200 European subnational units. So the previous study was again 400 commuted zones in the US, and they show that robotization, again similar strategy, robotization results in increase of radical right parties. So let me now break here because we have 15 minutes left, and so I'll be happy to answer questions. Maybe some have been accumulated by chat, or some people would like to unmute themselves and ask questions.
Well, okay, thank you, Sergei. Perhaps I'll pick a few questions from the chat because some of them are very pertinent to the issues you just raised. So first, we have Hector Calvo Pardo. First of all, saying that there seems to be a clear connection to lack of sufficient redistribution with which liberal democracies have been identified. So basically saying that I guess that many of the Anglo-Saxon countries that have less of redistribution have been now hit more. So how would you respond to that?
I fully agree, and I'll show you a paper on the UK where austerity after the global financial crisis can be shown to have causal effect on the rise of UKIP and Brexit. And we shouldn't blame all Anglo-Saxon countries. There is also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who are structured similarly to Nordic countries rather than to United States. But yes, you can say that lack of redistribution and inequality of opportunity has been an important failure of liberal democracies. And I would say that most politicians have learned this lesson in 2020. And so in 2020, most liberal democracies have been extremely generous, probably because they learned lessons from 10 years ago.
Okay, then perhaps two more. There's one from Melinda Fremere. How are attitudes towards economic factors, globalization, progress, related to election of populists? The attitudes might capture something in between economic and non-economic factors. And then there's perhaps a related question from Monica Martinez Bravo. How do we go from a family suffering from a negative income shock to supporting populist parties? Is there a literature from psychology digging deeper on the mental model behind this transition?
So as I mentioned, what is most exciting research agenda today is the interaction of economic and non-economic factors. So a lot of people speculate that you have underlying cultural divides, and then you have an income shock, which triggers the cultural issue. And that's when populists get a higher vote share. So it's very hard to study those issues. But overall, when indeed I show you the causal effects from robotization and automation, and when I show you next time the causal effects from a rise of unemployment after the global financial crisis and populism, that may actually be operating through triggering the cultural divides. And vice versa, when you think about the impact of cultural divides and you ask yourself, why now? That's again a potential explanation that there is this interaction between economic problems, and cultural problems, identity problems, social psychology problems. And I'll show you some papers on social psychology. So what has been really exciting field of research in the last literally couple of years is going back to a paper by Moses Chaillot, 2009, and rediscovering the social identity theory, which many social psychologists have worked on 50 years ago. And now you have at least several theoretical papers in economics, including some already being published, which look exactly at this impact, which is related to increased salience of certain issues and switch from left-right divide towards us versus them divide. And so these interactions are very, very important. And this is where we see social psychology playing a role, where an explicit model of how social identity is formed and how it evolves is directly related to what Monica probably has in mind. So this is where we are. So there are no good papers which show you the strong causal effect of interaction between economics and culture. And this is the frontier of the agenda. So if you ask me what to write about this. I've run some regressions on this, and if there is time, I'll mention those. But it's really, really hard to put together a convincing identification strategy that would tell you how economics and non-economics interact.
That's fascinating. Let me highlight one more question before I open the floor. From Mikael Castanera, on first of all, complimenting on great lecture, Sergei. I'm worried by the attempt at linking social media to populism. So newcomers who feel pushed back by normal media would, of course, invest in tools that give them competitive advantage in quotation marks. So if you observe that more media causes more populism, is it social media that is really the cause? Or I guess if it's that's the avenue that is available to them, then that they will choose that.
So let me jump ahead. I think it's a great question, Mikhail, and I'll talk about some evidence, which I strongly believe in, and I'll show you that the rise of mobile broadband internet in Europe in the last 10 years helped both left-wing and right-wing populists. And then I mentioned this paper on randomized controlled experiment where switching off Facebook makes people less polarized. In principle, the speculation is as follows. The successful populists are the ones who circumvent mainstream media. Because mainstream media, New York Times or CNN, are not the tools for a populist like Donald Trump to use, because they are in the hands of the elites. So you need a new technology to circumvent the mainstream communication technology. That's why populists often use new communication tools. And I mentioned William James Bryan today already. He was a great innovator because he used telegraph and railroads. He pretty much traveled thousands of kilometers during his campaign, unlike his opponent. And he sent his speeches by telegraph. Nazis, Goebbels, used radio, which was a new technology at that point. And there is a paper in QGE 2015 which shows the causal effect too. And so populists usually rely on new information technology. And social media may be special. And I refer to the survey on social political implications, political effects of internet and social media by Ruben Nikolopov, Katya Zhuravsky, and Maria Petrova in the Annual Review of Economics 2020, which shows that social media is special because you have zero barriers to entry and you have interactive effects. So Facebook allows people to talk back to you, which makes it especially attractive for populists who sell this idea of being in touch with the people. And so in that sense, it's something extremely attractive to populist narrative. And on top of that, of course, it's an outrage machine. And social psychologists say that the until very recently at least, Facebook and social media more generally were based on the business model related to attention economy. So their job is to keep you on the network, which means I need to show you posts which are more outrageous, more exciting, more interesting. That's why non-boring stuff travels more widely over social media. And that's been documented, actually. So false news travels more than true news. And so this is what many populists who rely on what's called alternative facts use social media more aptly. That said, I'm optimistic in the sense that first, Facebook and Twitter understand that, and in order to preserve their reputation, they try to self-regulate. I would say it's not sufficient, and it will be more regulation. I'm pretty sure of that. And second, I think mainstream politicians become more skilled, better skilled in using social media. And for example, if you told me 10 years ago that we would have a digital campaign by septuagenarians in the US, but this is what we had, right? Biden's campaign last year was digital, and his digital campaign was very successful. So people learn, and I hope that mainstream politicians will also know how to use social media. But again, this is also subject of debate, and it's an ongoing research agenda. And if you want to do research in this subject, there is a lot of stuff you can do research on. And I actually personally do research on this because I find it extremely exciting.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we have
let me
now...
follow up. There is a question by Richard, which talks about Fox News. Yes, Fox News and
okay,
cable
right.
news. Yeah, cable news is a bit like this new technology, but it was a new technology before social media. Yes, the rise of Fox News helped pre-Trump Republican populists. Yeah.
Okay. Now we have more or less 5 minutes until we wrap up. So I would invite people to open their microphones and their videos if you want to pose questions. Since we are limited, we have only limited time, please be brief. So do we have any questions?
Yes, so I may have one question for Sergei before we close. Something that I find surprising in the results you presented and in the debate is the fact that if we think that insufficient redistribution is important, how it comes that the rise is in right-wing populism as opposed to left-wing populism, which traditionally would be more redistributive. Thank you.
Hector, this is an excellent question, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk next time. And that's exactly why we need non-economic factors. This is where people say, look, you need non-economic factors to explain it, because there is something else than left-right divide.
Thank you.
Yeah, correct. So, further questions, comments?
If I can,
Hi,
sorry, go ahead.
Monica. I'm happy to wait, Michael, if you want. But okay, let me.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the excellent lecture. So I just wanted to follow up on the interesting answer to my question. And I know a little bit the work of Moses and so on, but I was thinking, how does this relate to this system of distrust in political institutions, discredit, and to some extent the feeling of despair that some, like Angus Deaton, is pinpointing into large fractions of the population. So I was wondering whether, more broadly in psychology or sociology, there have been like in-depth studies on what's going on in the mind of the people that is just processing the negative shock towards, believing and a complete that the system is completely discredited, right? Is this a natural process that we have seen in other periods? Or is this the combination of now there is like a supply of populists that, jump on that feeling and manipulate it in a way to gather their support, right? How is that feeling, for instance, is not conducting support for other forces that are, in the opposition but not populist?
Monica, this is an excellent question, and there are studies in psychology and in political science and in anthropology which we don't survey. And what we try to do, we try to look at better identified papers, and we had to limit ourselves somewhere. But yes, people say that indeed, once you have a salience of certain issues, people switch to different state of mind. And you mentioned supply of populism. There is a paper by Guizzo and co-authors, which initially was called Demand and Supply of Populism. Now they dropped supply exactly because it's very hard to identify certain issues. So this is a gap in the literature, and we don't know how to address that. And I fully agree with you. I'm pretty sure that this is right. So we also survey papers by Ben Enke, who talks about values, and people who vote for populists also believe in communitarian rather than universalistic values. So this is for sure. I'll also show you how people's happiness and trust is related to voting for populists. And this is not a well identified, it's a descriptive paper, but I think it's very important. It's actually directly relevant to what Hector was asking about, which people vote for left-wing populists and right-wing populists. They have different attitudes, different state of mind. They're pushed to different dimensions. And so all of that are excellent questions. It's just, this is what we don't really cover in our survey, and we had to stop somewhere. Yeah.
Thanks.
But we talk about social psychology, so that we do. Yeah. But
okay,
overall,
thanks.
talking about feelings, I would say that social psychologists say that social media in particular are an outrage machine. They use words like dark psychology. And they think that this machine propagates negative feelings. This is one thing. And the other thing is a lot of people say that populists use the feeling of fear. So what you need is fear. And that really helps. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Gil?
Yeah, Gilles. So, Sergei, if I may, to what extent the literature on populism that you have amassed and the literature on democratic backsliding overlap or offers complementarity? One of my frustration with literature on populism is that it tends to focus not exclusively, but predominantly on individuals and populist personalities, while the backsliding literature focuses more on institutional breakdown or institutional decline, which usually precedes or create a space in which populist leaders can rise. So to what extent does that fit with your economist approach, and in what ways economists look at these questions of institutional decline as a precursor for the rise of populist figures?
So I'll show you data on changes in values and trust in the system and how people vote for populists. But the whole book of Cultural Backlash by Norris and Engelhardt is exactly what you're talking about: change in values, backlash in values, the rise of support for authoritarian values and narrative, and the rise of populism. So this is their book, and I highly recommend this book. Even though it's not a book, it's pretty much a descriptive book. They run some regressions, but these regressions are not well identified. They don't have causal effects. They only have correlations. Overall, I'm not too scared about democratic backsliding. I have a co-author, Daniel Treisman, whom I mentioned. He has a paper. Well, he has a monkey cage article that tells you that economic backsliding is more like democratic backsliding is more democratic stagnation. So, but I'm worried about lack of democratization. But I think it's too early to panic.
Okay, thank you. And now time for the last question of today. So Mikael Castaneda, please go ahead.
Nana, thank you again, Sergei, for this great presentation. I want to ask something a bit orthogonal, I think, to what you are and will be presenting, but which is highly complementary. It's the policy implications. So take, for instance, the idea that the ECB should cancel some of the public debt. Okay, that's something that is heavily discussed. If you reason as an economist and you don't take political factors like populism into account, the answer is no. Should we actually modify our thinking, or do you know research beyond Danny Roderick? I'm basically thinking of Danny's main papers on that, but I don't know if you know literature beyond that.
So let's talk about that tomorrow. But overall, I should say that the quality of work on the drivers of populism is much higher, and quantity and quality of work on the drivers of rise of populism much higher than quantity and quality on the implications of the rise of populism. And that is even bigger and higher quality than the literature on the solutions and policy implications. And so, unfortunately, I can only speculate, and let's try to speculate tomorrow. And basically, I would just say that the whole, my takeaway from this literature is, if you leave people behind, you pay a price, and this price may actually be much higher than you think. So populists come to power, and if they're successful, they break so many things that going back is not easy. So this is my piece of advice to anybody. But let's talk in detail next time, because we are in Finland, and in Finland everything is on time.
Thank you. Well, actually, that's also a very good teaser for tomorrow. So we will continue tomorrow at the same time. So 4:30 in Moscow, 3:30 in Helsinki, 2:30 in Paris, Frankfurt, and 1:30 in London. And I'd like to thank Sergei for this excellent, very insightful presentation. I would like to thank everybody in the audience, extremely active. So see you tomorrow. Thank you.